Okay, so my name's Richard Budd. I'm a lecturer in higher education here in educational research in Lancaster, and it's my pleasure to introduce Pascal Angerhausen, who's a research assistant at the University of Hildesheim in Germany, and he's also doing his PhD at INCHA, the International Center for Higher Education Research, at the University of Kassel in Germany. And by strange coincidence or not so strange coincidence, Pascal is studying at Hildesheim, where I used to live, and um, he's a research assistant at Hildesheim, where I used to live, and he's doing his PhD in Kassel, which is where I spent 3 months of my PhD. Um, anyway, that aside, Pascal, thanks for coming. We're looking forward to hearing from you and the discussion. So feel free to post things in the chat. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Richard, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to present today on the topic of the inclusion and exclusion of students with disability in German higher education. What will I talk about today? I will start with some words regarding the research project Erfolg inklusiv, translates as success inclusive, which presentation today is based on and which also my PhD project is based. And then we'll talk about the diversity of students with disability and we'll elaborate on two different perspectives that we used in our analysis. And then I will go on asking the question how higher education disables students with impairments. And lastly, I would like to discuss with you how we can reduce exclusion and achieve inclusion. I have some demands about the future of higher education, and maybe today I will also support this kind of change that I want to see in the world. Richard already introduced me, but I think it's still interesting to hear about where I came from, also from a scientific standpoint. I did my bachelor in social sciences with sociology, gender studies, and political sciences. And then I did a master's in gender studies and sociology. I actually have this gender studies background. And in my first position as a research assistant at University of Kassel, I was a part of the project FASO, where it was about family solidarity and how family influences societal redistribution. So there I was thinking about political sociology, about welfare states, and about gender and family as some kind of principles of redistribution. And then this kind of new research project occurred. I saw that they're still looking for people. And this research project was Erfolg inklusiv. And this is where I met the topic of disability. And I thought it's really interesting to investigate this. I changed the topic of my PhD and focused all my research on this topic. Today, I'm a research assistant at University of Hildesheim, where I'm also teaching on inclusive education. So I come from the gender studies, comparative welfare state analysis, then this kind of higher education research focusing on disability and inclusion. And today, I'm even teaching those who are going to be teachers on topics of inclusive education, where I'm really happy to have this change. The research project Success Inclusive was funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research. And our part of the project actually consisted of different parts, but our part of the project aimed on examining the study experience of students with disability. And we did this by using qualitative methods. So regarding the methodology, we conducted 36 biographical narrative interviews. All interviews were conducted by the same white cis male team member who was trained in conducting interviews and is experienced in dealing with potential traumatic issues. This is quite nicely formulated. I did all the interviews, so I spoke to 36 people and not just once. Many of them I interviewed 2 times and some even up to 4 times. Following the principle of openness, we rejected any ascription of identities or categories in our interview and also when recruiting the students. We could do this because our recruitment focused on students who used individual accommodation at this specific university. So when I talk about individual accommodation in Germany, I refer to a specific social right, one could say, or institution that is called Nachteilsausgleich, which translates as disadvantage compensation. So we were looking for people who used disadvantage compensation and found students. And in the end, most of the students in our interviews were students who studied with disability. There were also some people who were, for example, pregnant or had responsibility of childcare and used individual accommodation because of this. But our focus is on students with disability or students with impairments, as we will see when I explain the concept. So the students in our sample share the experience of being disabled by the societal and institutional context of higher education. And for those who already worked in the field or read about it, I follow the social model of disability. So I assume that the context disables the students, and these are the ones that I'm interested in. So what did we actually do with our internet interview data? The collected data was evaluated using a grounded theory. So the first 4 interviews were used for constructing a coding system that was ongoingly revised. After coding 2/3 of the 36 interviews, no new categories emerged, and the following interviews were used to further develop concepts regarding their properties and dimensional variation. This resulted in the development of a purely ground theory to begin with, and in a last step, we developed a theoretical framework informed by the grounded theory and formal research. So I want to point this out that we actually worked purely grounded in our own data at the beginning, and then we started looking at all the other literature. And as you will see in the end of my presentation, we digged pretty deep and referred to a lot of current research because there is some great research right now, even though we were able to fill different gaps in the current research literature. So let us come to the terms impairment and disability. Following the social model of disability, we differentiate between impairment and disability. The impairment is conceptualized as a physical or mental experience of the individual person, while disability is understood as a negative outcome of the combination of an impairment and the contextual factors. In higher education, this negative outcome can take a variety of forms, including but not limited to the experience of underachievement in relation to others, stress, anxiety, or exclusion. So applying our theoretical understanding of impairment disability, we focus on studying with impairments that happens in a specific context and results in studying with disability. So from now on, I will usually use the term students with disability, and this group is what I mean. We do not focus on students who live with an impairment and who are not disabled by the context of higher education, but students with disability are those who are disabled by the context of higher education. So let us come to the analysis of the diversity of students with disability. When we looked at our data, we saw that students with disability are a highly heterogeneous group. And as I said, students with disability share the experience of being disabled by the societal and institutional context of higher education. However, we see that the experience of the students vary based on their impairments, their societal position, the resources, and the individual action. And today we will focus on different aspects of impairments and on intersections of disability with the educational background and gender. However, both the aspects of the impairment and the intersections will also refer to the need and the availability of resources. And you will see that we will also talk about some individual actions or strategies that we saw in the interviews and that students with disability usually use to mitigate disability or navigate studying with disability. So what did we actually do to investigate the diversity of students with disability? We used an intra-categorical approach. So since our research showed that studying with disability is a complex phenomenon, we had to reduce complexity. And to do so, we split the analysis of its intra-categorical diversity into two distinct research approaches. At first, we highlighted the intra-categorical diversity of students with disability by constant comparison of these experiences within the group. And in the second step, we applied an intra-categorical intersectional analysis, where we focus on the experience of students with disability that emerge out of the intersection of disability and class and disability and gender. So here we follow actually Leslie McCall, who wrote a great paper on the topic in 2005, and she stated that an intra-categorical intersectional approach analyzes the experience of one oppressed group that experiences a specific phenomenon, usually focusing on case studies and using qualitative methods with assumed categories. And in our research design, we analyze the study experience of students with disability at a German university and use narrative interviews or biographical narrative interviews, which are where we use a grounded theory methodology. Okay, let us stick to the first one, the highlighting the intra-categorical diversity of students with disability. When we looked at this group of students with disability, or when we look at the literature, usually researchers use terms like types of disability or types of impairment to understand different experiences. Other researchers also used specific symptoms, for example, studying while experiencing pain, but especially these types are what the research literature refers to. And interestingly, when I analyzed our data, this was not convincing to me. So I always was like, no, these using types is like referring to medical terms and all of this. And I am not able to understand the different experiences only by drawing on the types or even by just focusing on the types. And instead, we identified 4 aspects of the impairment that are of special relevance for studying disability. And at first, we saw that the time of onset influences the possibility to adapt to the situation. So identifying strengths and weaknesses, developing working strategies, accepting the situation, and legitimizing the use of accommodations, like many other processes, are processes that take time. And if students have more time to adapt to the situation, to deal with their individual situation, to learn, then they are better equipped to navigate the specific challenges that universities propose. The sudden and late occurrences are always experienced or nearly always experienced as challenging and can lead to postponing studies or even dropping out. The next aspect was also elaborated on in the literature. However, what we saw is that the visibility of an impairment is central to the societal position of students with disability. So students with visible impairments are recognized as disabled students by others, which are deserving accommodation. So others experience or others see those students as disabled and think like, yeah, okay, this person, for example, uses a wheelchair. I can see this, and this may be an appropriate reason why this person has a longer time to finish this assessment. However, students with visible impairments rather experience stigmatization because they are seen as disabled students by others. Students with invisible impairments, however, can hide their impairment and pass, to use a term that was coined by Judith Butler, as students without impairments. So they don't need to be visible to others. They don't necessarily experience this kind of stigmatization. However, they may have to disclose when they want to experience considerations or even use accommodation. So this is always a great problem for those students who live with invisible impairments. The question of how can I disclose, to whom should I disclose, do I even want to disclose, do I want to accept that there is something, or do I want to hide it and try to study, as the student said, just like other students who live without an impairment. The next aspect, where I could actually talk about a really long time, but I want to make it short, is the variability and predictability of the impairment. This is, in my opinion, central to the study experience. So being able to predict the cause of an impairment allows students to prepare for the future. Variable impairments pose challenges as students constantly need to adapt to changes. And even if they are predictable, variable impairments are experienced as rather challenging. So for example, if I know, okay, in the winter terms, I usually struggle with my depression, then it is good in the first moment because I know that in the winter term I will experience this kind of impairment. However, this leads to pressure as many students try to work double the amount during the summer term and then have to take a break in the winter term. And this is rather experienced as challenging. The last aspect are the time and energy costs. So navigating studying with disability can be time and energy consuming, depending on the impairment. Medical care, doctoral appointments, bureaucracy, and rehabilitation cost time and energy. Further, living with an impairment per se can limit the time and energy available. So in extreme cases, students reported of experiencing taking care of their impairment as time and energy draining as a part-time job. And just to underline this expression, the student told me that he actually has a part-time job where he takes care of bureaucracy, doctoral appointments, and all of this. And in this other part-time job where he's still studying with disability. So even in this time that he has available, he still needs more time to do the things that are necessary to proceed his studies. So based on those four aspects, we can already see that students with disability are a highly heterogeneous group. However, as I proposed, we also applied a second analysis, this intracategorical intersectional analysis. And here we see, when we look at the intersection of disability and class, that you can identify two aspects of class that are relevant for the study experience of students with disability. At first, we have the financial resources. And second, we have the identity of being working class. In Germany, we phrase this as being an Arbeiterkind, so a worker's child. That is actually a shared identity where there are also discourses surrounding it. And that's why I wanted to introduce this term to you. So looking at the financial resources, we see that financial resources are of special relevance for students with disability. When we look at the BEST 3 studie, a current quantitative study that is focusing on students in general, but also we have some kind of quantitative study that is focusing on the experience of students, and the BEST 3 studie focuses on the group of students with an impairment that negatively influences their study experience. So I would also phrase those as students with disability. And the data from BEST 3 shows that students with disability report more often about financial problems than students without disability. And it shows that students with disability need longer to study and rather interrupt their studies. All of this is focusing on Germany. So students with disability in our interviews who live with low financial resources reclaimed that they did not experience the support they would have needed both in school and at home, and had restricted access to auxiliary aids. This is quite interesting because I thought that actually the state would pay for the necessary auxiliary aids. But this is also depending on the specific situation. For example, I had one student with a visual impairment who explained to me that the state will only pay for one auxiliary aid. And since he was young and wanted to try out different kinds of auxiliary aids because he wanted to develop working strategies, and his visual impairment was even changing, he had to wait a full year after getting one auxiliary aid to be able to receive funding for another. And as you can imagine, this is rather challenging for the students. Other students who had enough funding were able to try out different auxiliary aids and were quite happy to have this change to develop appropriate working strategies and to deal with their variable impairment. Further, students were dependent on institutional financial support, the German BAföG, and had to schedule time for bureaucracy to apply for it. This is also interesting because the students reclaimed that they fear not receiving enough financial support. However, in the regulatory of BAföG, it says that students can receive an elongation because of their impairment. So if we just look at the rights, we could say, okay, the students have this kind of right. Still, the students feel pressured and feared not receiving this kind of elongation because every student receives 3 years for their bachelor studies. And if they need more time, they have to apply for this elongation. However, COVID occurred, and therefore, the students received 1 or even 2 free semesters of BAföG elongation. So this was quite interesting to hear that the students felt pressured at the beginning of the study, and as soon as they got this free elongation, this pressure was relieved, even though they expected to be granted this kind of elongation. And to add to the story, right now, BAföG is changing and every student should receive 1 flexible semester now. So every student, independent of any kind of impairment and independent of any kind of reasoning, is able to receive an elongation of 1 semester. And I think this is a great step into inclusion. So let us go on with the intersection of disability and class and the financial resources. Students with low financial resources questioned the marketability of their field of study and worried about the future. So they really digged into the literature, did some research on it, in which kind of field can I work with my impairment, what is really secure, what will provide me with enough money, and maybe even where can I also reduce hours because I'm not able to work 40 hours a week because of my impairment, and still I want to live a self-sustainable life. However, those students also emphasized that they lacked times for trying out different strategies, taking some rest, and sometimes even time for therapy or rehabilitation. So I got a lot of students telling me that they skipped this time and they did not take this time. And while I have all these quotes, I brought a quote with me today from Mira, who said in the interviews, "I'm lucky enough to be fully funded by my parents. If that wasn't the case, I would probably have dropped out a long time ago and would now be doing an apprenticeship or something." So other people with ADHD who don't have such an economic background, I think they would have been out of university long ago. I didn't have to apply for student loans, take care of things, or anything like that. None of that was ever an issue for me. And that makes it possible for me to study for longer and have a longer chance than others. I think this quote, as many quotes I will present, speaks for itself. So let us go on to the second intersection or the second aspect of class. And here we saw that students with disability or who identified as working class perceived the university degree as a way out of the working class milieu. Some even saw it as a necessity to achieve an individual and self-sustainable life. So they assume that without a university degree, the jobs that the labor market offers them are either not sufficient to provide a self-sufficient life, or it would be some jobs who would drain their energy even more and worsen their individual situation. Therefore, some students experience problems with their identity. And I brought a quote here today from Jonah, who said, "School sucked anyway. That's what my parents taught me. And accordingly, as I got older, the perspective became more likely, so school is the only way to change your life situation at some point. And it's lousy the way it was, and actually still is. I'm still not living the way I would like to live. In other words, I'm going through the classic ascent through education. advancement through education is an incredibly poor offer, but it's the only thing that schools can offer. If you're desperate enough, then you take up this offer. As you can see here, and as it was even more clear in the rest of the interview, the identity problems for Fiona got really intense. And they were so severe that Jonah, like some other students, even mentioned suicide in the interview. So he's torn between his family, who rejects any kind of education of the professors and wants him to pursue a position in the trades, and higher education, where he sees that as a person, he has the possibility to achieve a labor market position that provides a self-sufficient life. So to summarize this, student with disability who identified as working class pursued expected an academic degree as allowing them to pursue an independent life. However, they had to leave a part of themselves behind in this way. So if their parents rejected education and the professors and put pressure on them to do an apprenticeship, they experienced the situation as problematic and struggled with their identity. This struggle can severely impact the study experience and the life of the students. Some even mention suicide as an option if they are not able to achieve a degree and an appropriate position on the labor market. So just by looking at class, we can actually identify an intern hierarchy. We see that high financial resources and information about the study organization and marketability help mitigating the troubles of studying with disability. These students with an academic background can be expected to be better prepared to navigate the struggles of studying with disability. Further, first-generation students do not just lack these resources, but they may also have to deal with identity problems. Okay, when we now go to the next intersection, the intersection of disability and gender, I want to say at first that we had a small number of students who do not identify as men or women. However, because of this small number, today we will focus on those who identify themselves and are identified by others as men or women. Sexuality was actually not raised as a relevant factor by the interviewees. This we cannot make any statements about it. However, there is other research that highlights the relevance of gender identity and its linkage to sexuality regarding the disability identity that we cannot include here. So when we look at the disability, the intersection of disability and gender, we see that for men, gendered expectations and stereotypes influence the behavior of the students. Male students with disability have to deal with gendered stereotypes and negotiate their own masculinity. The men in our sample experienced sharing information about their disability as exposing themselves, and they described the disclosure as losing something, maybe masculinity. And here I brought a quote from Alex, who was talking to an employee of the university. Last week, there was actually someone sitting opposite me who I didn't know at all, and who then said to me, "Are you undergoing treatment?" And then I thought, that's not possible. There's no way that's possible. He says to me, "Are you in treatment?" You have to imagine you have this illness. You're sitting opposite people you don't know anyway. You have to drop your trousers and say, "I have an anxiety disorder," which is already a certain threshold because you don't get anything in return. That means it puts you in a strange situation anyway. I really like this quote because Alex, in this short paragraph, mentions two aspects that we repeatedly saw when we looked at the interviews of men, especially those with invisible impairments. And at first we have the sentence of, you have to drop your trousers. So this image of exposing oneself to sharing something that is deeply private and that maybe even reduces your societal position, or at least influences your societal position, was quite characteristic for these interviews. And the second aspect is this exchange that Alex mentioned. So, which is already a certain threshold because you don't get anything in return. So the men in our sample repeatedly mentioned this kind of exchange by disclosing they are losing something and now they want to receive something in return. And actually, if they received an appropriate amount, one could say, so if they were granted participation as equals afterwards, it was not a big problem, but especially if they felt that they were treated unfairly or they had this unequal exchange, they talked about this in the interviews. For women, we see that gendered expectations and stereotypes influence the behavior towards the students. In general, when we look at other work from the scientists who focus on these aspects, we see that women generally share the experience of living in a society that doubts their individual experiences. And in the interviews, in some cases, the woman reported of experiencing medical gaslighting. This term was actually not introduced by me, but by the students. And they are speaking about medical gaslighting when experiencing systematic doubts by medical experts. So these kind of experience of doubts strengthen self-doubts, because if someone who's an expert in the field tells me there is no reason that you, for example, experience this, or that you are not able to this or to perform like this, then the people think, okay, then it must be me, I must be wrong, I am not enough, and there is no explanation for these kind of experiences. And this can actually lead to giving up instead of fighting for their rights when encountering barriers. And here also brought a quote from Kira. The fact that I've already done that at 2 schools, that psychologists questioned me for hours, I don't know. I always felt a bit like I was being cross-examined in court. I thought it was kind of weird. I didn't even let it get that far at the university, so when the person in charge said, no, we can't do assessment accommodation, then I was like, yes, okay, but I'll leave it alone now. Well, I don't know. It always feels like I have to prove to someone that I'm really ill. And I've stopped doing that now because I have no idea. If someone doesn't want to recognize that I'm ill, then they won't recognize it after I've proved it. Yes, so it was just like that. I also think that this quote would speak for itself. So now I planned on having a short break, but looking at the time, I will just take a sip of water and then I will just go on. Okay. Now we learned a bit about the intercategorical diversity of students with disability. We saw that students with disability are a highly heterogeneous group. So what I said in the beginning, I hope that I was also able to show this by drawing on our analytic findings. However, if you listen to me, I argue that disability is an outcome of the interplay of context and impairments. Therefore, we cannot stop at understanding impairments. Rather, we need to understand how the context and the impairments interact. Therefore, I developed this model of studying with disability, where we have different circles that are embedded into each other. In the biggest circle, we have the societal context. Embedded into this, we have the higher education context. Embedded into this, we have the individual context. And embedded in this, we have the impairment, capacity, and performance. And I will further elaborate on the terms of impairment, capacity, and performance, but maybe from a methodological standpoint, to introduce my thought why I even did this, it is important to keep in mind that we can only reconstruct performances and subjectively experience capacities when we're doing reconstructive research. So following the biopsychosocial model and the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, capacity is understood as, I quote, an individual's ability to execute a task or an action. This construct aims to indicate the highest probable level of functioning that a person may reach in a given domain at a given moment. The capacity outlines the possible actions of student with impairments in the given context of higher education, while the performance relates to the actual actions that were observed in the interviews and former research. So when we look at the model again, we see that the performance are dependent on the capacity, which are dependent on the impairment, and which are dependent, or the experience of the impairment are dependent on the different contexts. And again, we can talk, or I could talk about this for a long time, but today I want to focus on the higher education context and its interaction with the impairment and how it shapes capacities and performance. And when we look at the higher education context, we see that the spatial conditions are of special relevance. Inadequate spatial conditions disable students who, for example, use wheelchairs or walking aids, but also those with visual impairments and other impairments that affect their mobility. Overcoming these barriers takes time and energy and may even be impossible for students, which makes them dependent on others or hinders participation. Further, students need possibilities to isolate themselves on campus, rest, or simply take a breather from the activity and noise of university life. These needs for retreat rooms, escape spaces, and other special structures are often not met, as other researchers also pointed out. So in particular, students with mental illness, neurodivergence, and those who experience regular pain describe these as a necessity in order to study adequately. Further, the learning environments are disabling students. Learning environments at university generally follow ableist assumptions instead of universal design. This makes students with sensory impairments dependent on the use of accommodations, auxiliary aids, individual assistance, and support from others. And here I brought a quote of Moritz, who told us in the interviews, if you have healthy ears and you have two ears, and there are two people in front of you talking at the same time, a healthy person can filter what they are hearing. Am I listening to the left or the right? If you only have one ear, you can't. You hear both at the same time and don't understand anyone. That was really difficult. You only think back to the first semesters when you still had a lot of lectures and there were 500 or 600 students in the lecture hall. The lecture hall is quite large and anything, but the lecture hall is quite large and anything but acoustically optimized. With the loudspeakers, it's quite good and helpful. But if you have problems with it, it's only to a certain extent. Exactly. That's why I decided to get a hearing aid after all. However, the learning environments at universities also restrict the capacity of students without sensory impairments. As Creven and also Sapir and Banai pointed out, some students with chronic illness and neurodivergence experience the environment of higher education as distracting and/or overwhelming. Bright lights, loud noises, and constant happenings can elevate stress levels and hinder participation. Lastly, even though COVID has shown that universities can also be attended digitally or through hybrid formats, most universities still rely on physical attendance. Students with social phobias, or anxiety disorders found the times of COVID rather unproblematic, as they were able to participate digitally, as both my research and the work of Pascal and Smith showed. The students with caring responsibilities or mobility issues shared these experiences in my interviews. So here I have a quote from Alex. In the winter semester 21-22, everything was online and that was really great. And then the lecturers always were like, oh, let's hope it gets better and we can all see each other in person again. And then I said, I don't think it's okay when you say that because you imply that we're all the same. I have this and that illness. I was able to study incredibly well because I can't leave the house sometimes. And then 2 or 3 of the other students jump out from behind. They say, yes, I have that too. I'm glad it's like this because in the first semester, I couldn't go to university at all because I had depression. And then they suddenly realize that there are people sitting there who also have a life, who aren't just a conformist group, but who think to themselves in the morning, I probably can't go to university because I have anxiety. And that's when I realized that the university doesn't actually respond to that. So while there is a lot of interesting information in this quote, let me just say that when physical attendance was required again, some students with social phobias or anxiety disorders struggled to attend university. Digital or hybrid modes of participation may therefore be necessary for some students with disabilities. Especially students with variable or unpredictable impairments report that the provision of different modes of participation can enable regular participation. Next, we will take a look at the bureaucracy. That was quite interesting because the bureaucracy at the university that was chosen for the interviews is generally perceived as transparent, friendly, and digitalized. However, the students reported problems they experienced at other universities. And while unfriendly staff and rude responses on the phone or in person exacerbate the situation for those struggling with mental illness and can be experienced as problematic by all students who must deal with them, complex requirements, such as the analog administration of exams, are experienced as a major problem by students with disability. Navigating these requirements takes time and energy, and is perceived by some students as an insurmountable barrier, leading them to dropping out, as it was the case for Sophie. She told us in the interview, the organization of my studies at the former university was catastrophic, and I had major problems with bureaucracy, organization, and self-organization. And among other things, I actually took several exams during my studies, passed them, in some cases passed them well, and then failed this process of I then have to go to the office hours to pick up a slip of paper saying that I've passed the exam. I then have to take the slip of paper to the examinations office, and they have to confirm that I have passed the exam and enter it into the system. That was the thing I failed at. And I actually had my enrollment canceled shortly before my bachelor's degree because I couldn't cope anymore. Further, the temporal organization of university is problematic for students with disabilities on many levels. Since students may need time to take care for their impairment, and the impairment may reduce or limit the amount of time they can be productive, as Price also explained in his great paper in 2021. If universities require students to study full-time, to complete certain credit requirements or assessments in a certain amount of time, this may not be possible for students with disabilities. As a result, students complain that their studies are not as flexible as they needed to be. This results in feelings of pressure, stress, or being not enough, which hindered in appropriate participation and raised thoughts about dropping out of university. And here I brought a short quote from Pia. I suffered from a loss of concentration and reading and listening skills as a result of this breakdown in everything that I have. So now when I read something, there are days when I can read and there are days when I can't. There are days where I can concentrate more or less well. That means I always have to check that out now, and that's why I've been stretching it out a bit longer. And maybe here we come back to these financial resources. While Pia has the possibilities to stretch it out a bit longer, other students may lack the resources to do so, or even have the possibility, but do not accept it as a legitimate possibility. Lastly, I want to talk about assessments, and I want to keep this short because actually I did a lot of research on the topic of assessment and individual accommodation in Germany. And Rebecca will also share a link with you where I wrote a short blog entry for the SIHE blog. So if you're more interested in this topic and want to give it a short read, you can do this after. However, for now, we can say that typically universities offer one type of assessment for each course. And if students are unable to participate, they must apply for accommodation. This is rather, or no, this is something that different researchers, especially Nieminen or also Dikova et al., elaborated on during the last years. However, in order to apply for assessment accommodations, students need a medical certificate. This means that they first have to accept and disclose their impairment. This whole process takes time and energy, and most students with disabilities in Germany actually do not use assessment accommodation. And even if the students manage to get assessment accommodations, I see, or I showed in the analysis of the interviews, that some do not experience this as an appropriate measure of inclusion. Therefore, I argue that in its current form, individual assessment accommodation does not provide sufficient inclusion to all students. So while students with visible and constant impairments reported of experiencing individual assessment accommodation as helpful, students with invisible and or variable impairments often did not. Disclosure, receiving medical certificates, remember medical gaslighting, those do not receive any kind of medical certificates, but also legitimizing the use of and organizing accommodation actually creates barriers to its use, like I also argue in the blog entry. So let me come to my last slide. How can we reduce exclusion and achieve inclusion? For me, there are three demands that I can derive based on my analysis. First, we need to recognize the diversity of the group of students with disability. Societal narratives surrounding students with disability still focus on visible and constant impairments. However, especially in higher education, this is not what students with disability usually look like. So the number of those who live with a visual impairment is really not that big. And there is a huge portion of students who live with an invisible impairment. Second, rather than finding individual solutions ex post, so after a student even experienced barriers as he was already excluded by higher education, inclusion needs to be based upon the principles of universal design ex ante. So we have to think about inclusion before students even encounter barriers, before they experience exclusion. So we have to work on the context of higher education to be inclusive. Right now, students with disability who are or make themselves visible actually provide extra work to the lecturers and academic staff. However, following the UNCRPD, universities have to provide inclusion. And this leads us to our next point and my third demand. The culture towards people with impairments needs to change. At universities, providing inclusive learning environments and possibilities for everyone to participate is part of our jobs. This also means that we have to provide an inclusive social environment without excluding students based on diversity markers such as but not limited to disability. Only if we end stigmatization of people with impairments and deconstruct ableism, students with disability can disclose their individual situations and participate in higher education as equals. So I hope that my presentation was helpful to support the first and the second demand. To achieve the third demand, all of us have to take responsibility and reflect our understandings of normality in everyday life, but also in higher education. Thank you very much for listening. And I also prepared the literature for those interested.
Okay, Pascal, thank you so much for that. There's a lot in there, a lot of different elements that people would pick out. As I said before, please feel happy to put comments or questions in the chat if you'd like not to read them out. If you'd like to ask a question, please do. While people are formulating their question, one of the things that I wanted to ask as sort of a chair's prerogative and also to kind of get the conversation going is that German universities are famous, let's say, for their bureaucracy in a way. So it strikes me as in a way that in Germany it might be worse than in some other places if the paperwork requirements are so steep that actually students with a disability face really high barriers at universities because there is a long and heavy procedure that comes with particular forms of Beamtendeutsch, kinds of language that are actually quite hard to negotiate. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I think this is maybe I think we have to differentiate here between universities and the broader picture of social rights, because just from my experience and what I derived from the interviews, actually at the chosen university, the students with disabilities said everything is working great. So everything is digitalized. It's so easy. I can just click here. And for example, if I suddenly experience pain and I feel like I cannot participate in this assessment, I can just make a click and I can even cancel my subscription to the assessment like one day before. So I would not say that the bureaucracy at universities in Germany are the big challenge. However, there are these universities with the big paper trail and not digitalized processes and all of this. I'm pretty sure that you can still find them today. But what was rather challenging to the students was the aspect of social rights. So in Germany, without making a too long story, even the question of who finances what is a big question. And you always have to apply it's a specific institution. And then they say, no, we are not responsible. Please ask there. And you can ask for financial resources there and argue like this, or you go there and argue like this. So I would rather say the situation for people with impairments who want to use their social rights. So we have great social rights in Germany, but using those social rights is a really challenging thing. And especially this one person who told me he has like a part-time job. He told me like he could use a secretary. He could hire a whole person just 10 hours a week doing all this kind of paperwork because he was actually financed by the pension insurance, because he was now not able to participate on the labor market, and it was really complicated, and it had a really long paper trail. And in the interview, he had like I think three big piles of paper only so he gets his studies financed. The social rights are rather challenging than bureaucracy at higher education.
Right. Okay. Yeah, no, well, that's an interesting one. And Germany is also famous for its bureaucracy. I think they still use fax machines in many places. Sorry, could you stop sharing your screen?
Oh, yeah, sure.
At least we can see you better, although now everyone can see me, which is less good. There's also another question here as to what the social situation is in terms of attitudes towards disability. I mean, would you call the situation in Germany somewhat friendly or somewhat antagonistic?
I think it depends. So when when I just focus on what was said in the interviews, the students often said that especially those who live with visual impairments, with visible impairments, they encounter stigmatization and exclusion on a daily basis. So when they are in class, they experience that people assume that they are not as able as others. They are not as capable. They don't know that much. And also, a lot of people feared interacting with them. And they phrased it in a rather positive way when they said, like, yeah, those friends, since I live with a visible impairment, those friends that I made in higher education, those accept me as I am. And this, I think, already says a lot about how the culture is. However, especially those who live with an invisible impairment and those with neurodivergent and all of this, rather said that during the last years, they felt like there is some kind of cultural change going on, especially in higher education. We have a lot of German influencers and other people who are currently publishing books especially women who live with ADHD and all of these other topics. So I think there is currently a cultural change going on, but I would not say that Germany is especially accepting or even especially antagonistic. Maybe this is also a question for someone who rather compares countries.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Two hands. Jonathan, you were first, so you're up. And Andy, I've seen your hand.
Okay. Pascal, thank you so much for the presentation. And somewhat depressingly, it's probably very similar to the UK, and which is a kind of sad case, I guess. But really interesting, and I think the data that you've pulled together and the analysis that you've conducted, I think is really novel and really useful. I guess I was interested as I was listening about it getting towards the end. I was thinking my question was sort of, well, what does an inclusive system in Germany look like? And you articulated, I think, those three sort of demands, if you like, which answered my question. But then I was wondering, I guess, how possible that you feel that is in the German context, because ultimately we can have ideals and a sort of utopian future which we would hope for in higher education and beyond. But I guess it comes down to the question of how realistic that might be in terms of its kind of actualization. So yeah, my question is, your three demands, how practicable, how realistic, what would need to happen to make those a kind of reality for disabled students?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. I think there are some things that we can do in the near future, and there are some things that will really take time. And this whole cultural change is something where we have to work on now, but I think we will see in the future. So I was at a conference in older scientist who's working in the field of higher education research told me that change in higher education needs 30 years. So I think to change cultures, we need 30 years. And we have to start now. And for example, I am at the University of Hildesheim. I'm teaching those who are going to be teachers, and I sensibilize them for these topics. And maybe in 30 to 50 years, all of them know about it. So this is the longer period. But in the shorter period, we can actually do things. For example, like when I spoke about BAföG, like just changing it to every person who is using individual accommodation, so this Nachteilsausgleich, automatically receives an elongation of BAföG. When he receives 50% more time for his exam, he receives 50% more time of BAföG. This would be quite an easy thing. Also, if you write or if you're planning assessments, why is a lecturer allowed to only make one assessment form? Why don't just require everyone to prepare 2 or 3? I bet if every lecturer at university would offer even 2 or even 3, I usually offer 2 to 3 different kind of assessments, many people who need individual accommodations would not need them anymore. So there is no reason to disclose. So even though the culture may not change now, those people would be able to participate in higher education.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you. Andy has said that his mic is playing up, so I'll read both of his questions, or I'll paraphrase both of his questions. The first one is which do you believe is more impactful? Is it institutionally specific measures or is it sector-wide measures? Because obviously local measures can be tailored towards individuals, but then you need to have systemic things too. So which of those do you think is more impactful? And the second one relates to the sense of whether or not there's a hierarchy within the community of students with disability, of people who are more or less disabled / deserving. I see you nodding as I read that one out. So those two questions.
I think I want to focus on the last question because this is also one that is really interesting when you think about this. Because when I talked about this kind of hierarchy, it's not a hierarchy of societal position. And it's also not a hierarchy of who's like more disabled or less disabled. but it's a hierarchy in the specific context of higher education where we can see those are able to perform better than others. And for example, if we look at the publication of Goldberg, she made visible that in general, people with visible and constant impairments are usually recognized as those with disabilities. And the other people with invisible and variable impairments, those are usually not visible. So I do not want to talk about who in the end experience life in a better way, or even who stands better, who has more resources, but just in this specific context, we see that individual accommodation carries to the needs of those with visible and constant impairments. And those who live with other kinds of impairments cannot deal with the situation as good as the others. This can still be that those with invisible and variable impairments are still more successful or happier with it or anything. But this hierarchy is only focusing on this specific focus that I elaborate here. And could you rephrase the other question again?
Yeah, the other question relates to the value of sector-wide, so let's say national guidelines, but also how effective those are, but also how effective it is that individual institutions then take that potentially and take it further. So you have the big rules, but then, of course, even within somewhere like Germany, where things are highly regulated, different universities behave in different ways, or different organizations.
Richard, can you hear me?
Yeah, go on.
Oh, okay, it is working then. Sorry, it's Andy here. Yeah, my point was really that when talking to students sometimes with disabilities, they'll say, well, yes, there are all these big issues societally, but you know what really makes a problem? When I go down to that office, they can't do this and can't do that, even though I know there's a way of getting around it. So to that student in that immediate moment, by being able to get around that particular issue, will have a significant impact and will have a very deep and profound impact. But of course, that's a very specific, institutional specific situation. So which is better for you? And I'm asking you really here as a researcher, do you feel, is it to provide those big answers that you go to a conference and people would go, yes, we can see that, we can employ that? Or is it about being able to get into an institution, do that sort of very ground level analysis and do something that institutes immediate change for people on the ground in that particular institution?
I think it's both, because both are connected to each other. So for example, at University of Hildesheim, we are ongoingly working on making the higher education more inclusive. And if we do so, we always draw on the UNCRPD. And we always draw on the normativity that Germany said they want to follow. And this is kind of our basis. So if this would not be there, we would have to go to the presidency and say, okay, yeah, we need this because of that. And because there are these kind of big rules, or even one could say big aims, we are able to argue for our points. However, in our work, we also draw on these kind of small initiatives. So both are important to change. And I think we cannot rely on structural change or individual change, but both always have to come together because they are in the end dependent or interdependent.
Thank you.
Thank you. As another question, one of the things you talked about was the importance of ex ante implementation. So essentially having these things built in. Is there any research which talks about how academics in particular view these issues? Because one of the strong features of the German university system is the freedom of professors to teach and assess according to their will, their right. To what extent is there perhaps resistance to wider inclusion of teaching delivery, assessment, and so on?
I actually did not conduct this kind of research, but I know from those who did, in especially Germany, that usually they find out that most lecturers lecturers just lack knowledge. So it's not like they do not want to provide inclusive education, but rather they do not know. Sometimes they do not know how to teach at all. They do not know about rights. They do not know about the specifics of the learning environments that would be necessary. So I would rather say we need to educate them. So also following the UNCRPD, where it says, okay, the universities have to take responsibility and teach their lecturers. This is something that we are also currently working with at the University of Hildesheim, and where I also want to work on in the German context. And I know that other researchers in Germany are currently working on this. So for example, there are different courses on universal design for learning in higher education that are currently offered on in different universities. And I really hope that this is rather a regular occurrence, especially since universities regularly teach their PhD students, and it is a quite normal occurrence that to have this kind of certificates, teaching certificates. And I really hope that Universal Design for Learning will be a part of this in nearly all of the certificates in the future.
Great, thank you. Sally, you raised a digital hand.
Hi, Pascal. Can you hear me?
Yes, Sally.
Thank you. That was really, really interesting. Really enjoyed listening to you talking about it. I just want to go back to the slide about disability and gender. And I was really interested in the different perspectives that you highlighted between the men and the women, and that the men saw it as almost like a loss to disclose their disability, and felt like it was an unequal exchange. And the women felt like talked about medical gaslighting and other people doubting their disability, and that could lead them to giving up the fight. And I just wondered why really you thought those different perspectives were to be found or emerged, and if that, if any elements of the way that the women felt about medical gaslighting was there in the data from the men and vice versa. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a super interesting topic, because like when we are working with this kind of methodology, we always follow the like subjective sense making, like Max Weber and all of this. And so it could be that both experience the same. It could be.
Yeah.
We can't really be sure. But what I can clearly see in the interviews is that there were only women talking about medical gaslighting. And there were only women who told me, yeah, everyone is doubting my experience. And I had these kind of symptoms, and yeah, my boyfriend was telling me I should just do it. And when my doctor was telling me this, and I had no men ever mentioned something like this. So it could be that all of them are receiving the same doubts and just experience it differently. However, as they presented it, I conclude that medical gaslighting is rather something that women experience, or those who are seen as women experience and report on. And this kind of exchange, while women also reported of this kind of exchange, they did not really report on this kind of losing something. So yeah. Like if I tell someone something, if I meet with someone and tell them, yeah, I have, for example, this kind of impairment, I need this, I always want to get something. Mm-hmm. But for the woman, it was not that important. They are actually losing something and having to receive something in return.
Do you think there's any question of value there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you mean like a value?
Yeah, like an exchange value. Like I'm giving you something, you give me something back almost.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely. That's why I argue that they lose masculinity. So for them, okay. It's kind of a loose. So one could also just phrase it. I'm a lesser man because of my disability.
I'm with you.
And this is also what disability studies and research of men who experience or who live with an impairment also show, that there is this kind of experiences by the men. And this, I would say, is what they argued in the interviews. And I also have, I argue this because there are interviews where the students really draw on this kind of understanding of men. For example, by drawing on specific cultural backgrounds, they say, men from this or that country, they are not depressed because they are big and strong. And they are, for example, one person tells me he's the poster child for his mother, and he's not able to have this kind of disability, and therefore he does not accept, disclose, and anything like this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Andy, you're back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I've got so many questions fizzing out of me on this one, so please forgive me. Just on the gender one, before I come back to what was going to be original question, did you find that there was any data around men giving the impression that they felt a need to fix things? Because there's something in certainly British masculinity that I feel that there is a sense of that if you want to sort of go down a gendered role, that masculinity can often present itself as, well, if there's a problem, I will fix it. And of course, the nature of disability is that it's not always fixable. Is that something that you saw in your data?
Yes, partly. I would rather rephrase it as men are maybe a little bit more active. But this is rather an impression I had. I would not phrase this as a finding. And I think to be better able to compare men and women in these cases, we actually need more quantitative research or even some kind of mixed methods research, because else we are just like projecting some kind of existing narratives on this topic. And this is also why I pointed out that we really at first worked purely grounded, because I tried to reduce this kind of effects of prior knowledge on our data.
Thanks. Another question was, you said earlier about some of the students reporting that they didn't feel their lecturers had the skills to do it. Was it the skills in terms of specific skills, like, you know, what sort of room they needed, the specifics of the adaptation, or was it the will to learn in an inclusive, was it that having an inclusive mindset that meant you asked those questions to start with?
Yeah, that's interesting, because it refers to another point, I think, and that is like excusing the behavior of the lecturers. Like when I reconstructed what was actually happening, I saw that many students excused the behavior of others. So they downplayed their experiences and said, yeah, and I'm providing so much extra work, and this person also has so much to do, and therefore he or she cannot do this. And I absolutely understand it. So just looking at the interviews with the students, one could have the impression that all of the lecturers just don't have the time. But when we look at other research, we can clearly see that the lecturers lack knowledge. They don't know how to even talk with some people with disability. They don't know how to provide inclusive learning environments. And here I would not just say that the culture is lacking or the willingness is lacking, but I would actually say that there is some kind of competences that the lecturers are lacking. And the interesting question is, if we achieve this kind of competent lecturers, is there still some kind of culture that they do not want to provide these inclusive learning environments? I expect them to be, especially in some kinds of disciplines, but this is maybe a research topic we can work on in the future.
Yeah, when you should say that.
Yeah, thank you. Also, we have Anna beaming in from Japan, and who's looking at a similar topic and wanted to share something on this that might be of interest. Anna, over to you.
Oh, thanks. Well, first of all, thank you. This is very exciting. I don't know how I'm still awake. It's almost 11. But I'm fully awake, and basically a lot of information really connects to what I'm doing, but from actually the other side of the coin. So I'm really looking at English lecturers specifically in Japanese higher education institutions. How do they accommodate individuals, not specifically with disabilities, but any individual accommodations? I guess most of the time it is actually students with disabilities, and from I've just started recently, and but I've been, well, privately researching the topic for some time now, and it seems like lecturers to some degree are looking for the green light from the institution and prefer to, well, I guess they feel at ease if everything is written and designed for them and they can follow the instructions. However, we all know that that is not the reality, and every individual is unique. So there is no instruction. So I did put reasonable accommodations in quotation marks because, well, not because, but we all know that they are unreasonable. So I am specifically targeting assessment accommodations that individuals make or not, and what are their motives for either choice they make. Yeah, I don't have the findings yet. So these are my guesses, I guess. And I was really curious, what is the situation like in Germany? But Richard brought up the question, so I think I can really, well, my predictions are well aligned with what you already referred to. So it is an enormous issue in Japan, enormous issue. They just this year, they started accommodating students with mental disabilities in 2024, sorry, last year. So private universities are obligated officially from April 2024 to accommodate ADHD and ASD, for example, but not depression yet, for example. I'm just giving you how, like, just a little insight.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing your experiences. At first, I want to say it would be really interesting to keep in contact with you. So please just write me an email if you want to do some exchange on the topic. Secondly, I think it's interesting that following this kind of bureaucracy is maybe something that a lot of countries share. Because, like you said, the examination offices, I also interviewed some people who work in the examination offices, but these were not like in the big focus of the analysis. But what they told me, or what they how they often argued was, yeah, there is no kind of framework. I don't know what's right. Like, I have someone with ADHD. Do he needs like 50% more time to 100% more time, another kind of assessment form? And like from my standpoint, I would say, yeah, maybe ask this person, and then the medical certificate has to state a need. And then we come to the next question: why is a doctor qualified to state a need for a person who studies in a specific field? And then the people in the examinations office say, yeah, the doctor is not qualified and he demands 100% elongation. But we think that's wrong and we only give them 30% time elongation. And then the student is sitting there and is asking himself or herself, yeah, but is this fair? Is this appropriate? What even is this? For example, those who are studying to become a teacher hand in the same medical certificate in the first field, the second field, and in the field of pedagogy. And they receive 3 different kind of accommodations. So why are they allowed to write 50% more time there, 100% more time there? And if you talk to the examinations often, they are always like, yeah, we also don't know. Sometimes the person who was working here before me, they wrote down everything and now I just do what they say. Or they say, yeah, I have, for example, relative who live with this and that, and I know things. So it's more like a personal experience and assuming things than really finding appropriate solution. And this is also something that I elaborate more on the paper about individual accommodation in Germany, where it makes really clear that this also leads to doubts. Like, the students themselves ask themselves, is it fair that I'm allowed to write 100% more? Maybe the one in the examination office was wrong. Maybe the doctor write a medical certificate because he knows my family. I don't know. And this also does something with the people. if they do not assume their accommodations to be fair.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that there are rules for things, but also there is then interpretation within the rules, even in highly regulated settings. Let's say, I guess that in a way, and also coming back to Anna's question, or thinking about different contexts, that's why your concentric circles, is concentric the right word? Your embedded circles, actually, the way this actually fits and the way this transfers. Has this been written up as a theoretical paper, or is this something that you're writing as a theoretical paper?
Yes, I'm currently writing on the paper, and I hope it will be published at the end of this or at the beginning of next year.
Fingers crossed on that.
Thank you.
So we're running short of time unless anyone has a really brief question. I just again like to say, Pascal, really nice to see you online this time, and thanks so much for coming and sharing your work. I knew it would be really interesting, and you gave a slightly a deeper version than you did in the conference, so we got to see a lot more of the social model of disability and stuff that we talked about when we met. But again, thank you very much for coming, and thank you also for everyone for coming, hanging out, listening, asking questions and prompts. There's a good bit of discussion going on in the chat as well. The recording will go up on our website in due course. And before I go, I would like to remind everyone that the next seminar is on Wednesday, the 26th of February, so just over a month, at 12:30, same time. And Dr. Oliver Mutanga will be talking about resolving the public-private good binary in higher education using Ubuntu philosophy. So that's another one not to miss. So Pascal, again, thank you. And to everyone, nice to see you. And take care.